Good morning, everybody. It's Dr. Karen. Just checking to make sure my microphone's on before I start talking. So this morning, I wanted to pop in and just share a little bit about some of the newest content that's going to be on the blog and some conversations that I've been having with my readers about supporting students with high-functioning autism and other conditions that impact social pragmatic language and social cognition. So I've gotten a lot of questions this week, and this week and the following weeks, I'm going to be popping in, sharing some different information and trainings about supporting students on the spectrum. Now, these next couple weeks, we're going to be talking more about high-functioning autism, but I will be sharing some other opportunities for you to get some support if you are working with students who are nonverbal, lower functioning, so students who maybe are using AAC, things like that. But really, this next couple weeks, we're focused on those students who are, again, what you would consider high functioning. So these might be students who maybe they don't have any other academic issues other than the issues that are impacted by autism or their pragmatic issues. So a lot of times these students, they might be doing pretty well academically, or they might be very bright, very capable. They might have some behaviors that are impacting how they are performing in school, but overall, the main issue is surrounding social cognition. And so I wanted to just pop in and ask a question or answer a question that has come up a lot. So I get a lot of questions about picking goals, figuring out how to take data, figuring out how to manage those behaviors and motivate those students who might have those severe behaviors. So sometimes it might be very significant. So especially if you've got a student who's nonverbal, obviously there are a lot of behaviors there. They can't communicate what they want and what they need. So a lot of times we see some behaviors because that's the only way that they've learned to communicate their needs and share what they want. And then also we see it manifest a little bit differently if we have students who are higher functioning. So sometimes that might manifest like defiance, refusing to do something, or just being rude and acting in a way that we would not expect or that is not desirable for certain social situations. So the main question I wanted to answer today is, how do we help students with social cognitive issues behave and act appropriately across different social situations? So, and I say appropriately in quotation marks because that actually might not be the best language to use when we are writing goals and when we're just thinking about the big picture of what we want for those students. So we'll get to that in a second. But the reason that I wanted to address this issue today is because, number one, it's usually our ultimate goal is that the reason that we're working on pragmatic language is because we want those students to be able to function socially so that they can do all of the things that we associate with having a good life. So things like, obviously, some immediate needs like being able to get through the school day without getting reprimanded, getting really frustrated and confused about what they're supposed to be doing, doing something totally inappropriate and getting punished for it, like refusing to do work and then having to miss recess, or getting a detention, having all of this homework built up because they haven't been doing it, whatever that may be. And you know, obviously those other consequences that are associated with not getting your work done and not getting good grades. So obviously there's some immediate needs there that are social related, but can also impact academics. And we know that if we don't remediate those things and give students a way to compensate, then those problems that they're having now in elementary school and secondary school are going to follow them through life. So that means that it's not just about what's happening right now and getting a good grade on this test or passing this class, but it's more about, okay, how can we lay that foundation for the future? And for a lot of students, it's, are they going to be able to function when they get to college? And or whatever it is that they're going to do after high school, whether that be having the social skills and the discipline and the ability to problem solve through situations that might come up when they have a job. So a lot of times we worry, well, if they're doing this now when they're in elementary school or high school, what's going to happen when they have a job and their boss asks them to do something and they say no and they get fired? How are they going to hold down a job? And then other things like just having friends and being able to participate in extracurricular activities and knowing the rules to work through some of those things. So these are all things that a lot of us did growing up, that a lot of us are striving for. And we know that the behaviors that our students are showing right now are inappropriate, unexpected, and will negatively impact them and their ability to do all of those things that I just mentioned successfully. So a lot of times when it comes to writing goals, and I'm not going to get into a nitty-gritty how-to today because I think there are some bigger philosophical things that we need to understand about the big picture before we can even think about looking at pragmatic language goal banks or looking at lists of materials and figuring out what materials to order to get the best social stories and what have you. So I wanted to start out by talking about three main things and three main concepts, or actually I should say skills, that we need in order to function in social situations, and then a more appropriate and realistic way to think about our goals for students who have high functioning autism or other conditions that would impact pragmatic language. So what I wanted to do now, I am going to share in the chat. I did write a blog post. It just went live this week, and it's called Social Pragmatic Intervention, the 3 Essential Components. And I'm actually going to just touch on it briefly today, but next week at same time, same place, 9 a.m., I'm going to be doing an in-depth presentation that should go 60 to 90 minutes to really go into this framework that I'm just going to give you the kind of quick and dirty version today, but I'm going to go into a lot of detail about it next week. And that Facebook Live that I'm going to do, it would be Monday at August 12th at 9 a.m. That's actually going to be kind of a dress rehearsal for a webinar that I'm going to be doing the following week. So stay tuned for some more in-depth information. But this blog post actually gives you kind of the high-level view of this framework that I'm going to just share with you right now, and that I'm going to be going into in depth in the Facebook Live next week, and then in the live webinar that's going to happen the next week after that. So there's the blog post. I just shared it right there, again, called 3 Essential Components to Pragmatic Intervention. But I'm going to share what those 3 components are right now, because I think this will help you to figure out just how to think about these types of interventions. So in order to be able to function in social situations, we need to be able to integrate 3 things. So thinking, feeling, and doing. So thinking is that cognitive element. So do we know what to do in a certain situation? Again, that's just, do we have the knowledge and those skills to be able to act appropriately in a certain situation? A lot of times, students with pragmatic language issues literally do not know how to act in a certain situation, because most of us were in these situations day to day, and we can just kind of figure it out implicitly. We know that a lot of those students, they don't pick up on those subtle cues that help us to learn implicitly, so they just haven't noticed those little details that cue them as to this is how you're supposed to act in a certain situation. And so that means they need to be taught a lot of those things explicitly that we're all catching on to on our own. However, we spend a lot of time in the thinking element and, explaining and talking through hypothetical situations with students and explaining what they should do and quizzing them on how they should act and solve a certain problem. And that's really important. We absolutely need that. If you don't know how to act in a certain situation and you don't have the knowledge, you're not going to be able to apply the skill in that given situation. But that's not enough. And that is why a lot of times our students don't act appropriately, as we would say it, because they might know what's appropriate and what's expected in that certain situation. They might know how to answer your question about what do I do in this certain situation, but there might be something else that's causing them to not actually do it. So that's why we've got thinking, the cognitive element, feeling, and doing. Now I want to talk about feeling next, because all three of these things impact each other. So think about, let's say that you drove to work and somebody cut you off on the way to work, and that really annoyed you. And you were already late because maybe your kids took forever to get ready. So you're already on edge. Your spouse forgot to do something that they said they were going to do. So you're already feeling crazy. Then somebody cuts you off. Then you get to work. And then you find out that somebody scheduled an IEP meeting and they didn't tell you. And they're like, oh yeah, sorry, we forgot to put you on that invite, but there's a meeting in 10 minutes. So you're just gonna have to drop everything that you wanted to do this morning and go to this meeting. Hopefully they'd be more socially appropriate than that in their delivery of that message, but you never know. So think about your emotional state in that situation. And then let's say that after all of that, somebody calls you on the phone and asks you to come in and screen one of their students later today. How do you think you're going to treat that person? You know probably how you should react when somebody asks you at your job to do something. I mean, you probably should say, yes, I'd be happy to do that, and ask them some questions about what's going on, and then find a time that's mutually agreeable for you to come do that. But you're already up to here. Your anxiety is here. You're really annoyed. Chances are you might respond differently to that person than if you had a nice calm morning, everything went well, you got to work early. It's one of those days where you're like, yeah, I'm conquering the world. I got everything done on time. Hopefully you have some of those days, some of the time. And then you were prepared for the IEP meeting. And then you had, oh, look, you've got some extra plan time that day. So you've got tons of time. And then this person asks you to come in and screen their student. Chances are you're going to be in a lot different state in scenario B than you are scenario A. So coming back to the whole point of thinking, feeling, doing, you know what to do in that situation. You cognitively understand the behaviors that are appropriate when somebody at your job asks you to do something. But you're in a different emotional state, so you are going to act differently in both of those situations. Hopefully, most of us have enough self-control that we'd be able to keep it under wraps and not do something that would be devastating to our career just because we're having a bad day. But we might not be as sunshiny and chipper in the scenario where we're stressed out, because the way that we're feeling impacts what we actually do. And I mean, you can even think about how you might even respond to your family members when you're having a bad day. You're probably a lot nicer to them when you're rested and calm, even though you know it's probably not a good idea to snap at your spouse for no good reason. So you are a person who, if you do not have a condition that is known to impact social cognition, you have some skills and self-control and the ability to manage those feelings and hopefully have some strategies so that you know how to respond somewhat appropriately, even if you are having a bad day. You also are not going to be as triggered as somebody who is on the spectrum because your sensory profile is different. But think about people who are on the spectrum who change is a lot harder for them than someone like us. It still annoys us. We don't like it, but we are better able to deal with this. It's not quite as anxiety inducing for us as it is somebody with one of those conditions. So what brings us here might bring them here. And the higher you get up here, the less self-control you're going to have. So if we are not managing those things, it doesn't matter how much cognitive abilities those students have. If they are too high up here, they're not going to do what you actually want them to do in those certain situations because there's going to be something else that's going to impact it. Now, and then it's kind of a cycle where, let's say that if you repeatedly are in a situation that is negative for you, you're also going to build up some negative feelings towards that certain situation. And then that's going to impact how you act as well, which happens with students on the spectrum a lot. So the point being that there's another factor here. How you feel impacts what you do. Now, I wanted to go on to doing as well because there are other reasons besides anxiety that can impact how you are actually acting. So there are other things like sometimes it's just defiance. So remember that students on the spectrum they might, because of those other factors, be more likely, or we might see those defiant behaviors more often because they might get to that height of anxiety, or they might not understand what's appropriate. So we might see those defiant behaviors more often, but sometimes that's literally all that they are defiant behaviors. All kids, all people have defiant behaviors some of the time. So sometimes they might not be doing something because it might just be a choice. They might not want to. And then the other thing is that there are, because of different sensory profiles, there are things that might be extremely distracting to them. I had a student who was in a classroom that, like, you walked into the classroom and I felt like I was going to have a seizure. It was so distracting. There was stuff everywhere. And for some of the kids, it might have been very visually appealing, but for this particular student, it was just very distracting. It caused him to be anxious. And so he was always like, he'd be sitting there, he was supposed to be doing his work or listening to the teacher, and he'd get up and go do something and go look at something because it was like, he'd see it and just go. He didn't necessarily know how to control those impulses yet. He hadn't built up the strategies for managing that, and he'd get in trouble because he got out of his seat. And it was just a distraction. So he knew he wasn't supposed to do it, but it was like he couldn't help himself because of that impulse feeling and because he was distracted. So there are other things like anxiety, our mood, just strict defiance, and attention issues that can impact what we're actually doing. So that's how, again, we've got those three things there. There's the feeling aspect, but then there's also the doing aspect. There are other things that can impact what we're actually doing in those situations besides just cognitive knowledge. So a lot of times when students who have had tons and tons of social skills interventions and have talked through scenarios up the wazoo, and they're still not doing them, it's because maybe we haven't fully problem solved how they're feeling in that situation and how that's impacting them. And then also other factors that could impact what they're actually doing, like attention and just behavioral things. So there might be other reasons that are causing students to not act appropriately. And I wanted to wrap this discussion up by talking about some different language we can use when it comes to helping our students with pragmatic language issues and challenges in that area, just helping to shape their behavior so that we can get them to be more functional and more successful over time. So I wanted to just talk about the word appropriate and then insert another word. So instead of being appropriate, what we want our students to do is be functional. So it's not that we are trying to, it's not that we're selling them short. It's just that we want to think about what is the next level that's going to get them where we ultimately want them to go. And sometimes being functional is good enough and is just fine instead of being appropriate. So let me tell you what I mean. So I had a student who had a lot of anxiety. He'd have a lot of outbursts. And when he was in a situation where he was overstimulated or he was upset about something, when he was in kindergarten, he would show some aggressive behaviors like self-injury or hitting somebody else. And then he also occasionally he would swear. So this is when he was in kindergarten. And so those behaviors would get him out of the certain situation that he was in. So they were actually very effective for him because they got him what he wanted. They were not appropriate, but they were effective. So obviously, when you think about that situation, those are behaviors that, even though they're effective, we can't allow our students to continue to do. We can't allow him to continue to hit himself, hit other kids. That's just dangerous. So those are behaviors that are not acceptable. So we worked on the hitting. We did do some, again, cognitive work, social stories, things like that. We did some behavior charts with him where we had to outline, these are the things that you're supposed to be doing. And he would get a sticker if he got it right, or if he went a certain time period without hitting somebody or doing something inappropriate. And obviously we had to outline what he should have been doing in its place as well, like hands to yourself, doing your work, looking at the teacher. And I wanted to clarify here, the sticker was more as a data point that he could see rather than this is your reinforcement. He did eventually get some type of a reward at the end of the day if he got so many stickers, but the stickers weren't the reward themselves. It was just more like data collection so that he could see his progress. But we eventually were able to shape the behaviors to where the self-injury and hitting went away. But then we found by the time he was in second grade, he would just be like, he'd be sitting doing his work and he'd be upset about something and he would like yell the F word out really loud in the middle of this classroom. Also totally inappropriate, and yet again effective because he'd get everybody's attention, and then a lot of times it would temporarily get him out of the situation. And really what was happening was that usually there was something that was bothering him that he wanted to talk about, and he didn't know how to express it. He didn't know how to say, like, it's bothering me that this person is sitting too close to me, or it's bothering me that I'm in a different seat than I normally am, or whatever it was. There was usually something that set him off, and he would say something like, he would say all kinds of crazy things. Like he would even say something like if he was upset at a certain student, he would say something like, Sally is dead. And that just meant like, I'm upset with Sally. But that was just the only thing. I don't know if it was something like, you're dead to me, but it sounded really inappropriate. So the point was that we got rid of one really inappropriate behavior. And then there was this other one but it was still progress because he was using words. Not that we wanted to allow him to shout F-bombs in the middle of class, but it was still effective. So again, appropriate, effective. It was effective, not appropriate. So then we got him to the point, again, did the same kind of thing where we were shaping, we were explaining like appropriate ways to say certain things. We had to do a lot of problem solving and looking at what happened right before the particular event to figure out what he was actually trying to say. And then, so then we were shaping the behaviors to give him words that were actually accurate and more appropriate than saying something really negative about a peer or saying a swear. So then we got him to the point, by the time he was in third or fourth grade, that he would say something that was pretty much accurate. He would say something like, Johnny is mean, or I'm mad at you. And he would say it in a way that was really rude. His intonation would be inappropriate, but he was pretty much explaining how he was feeling. And he was doing it effectively, and he was getting his point across. So the parents and some of the teachers were getting a little bit bent out of shape about this because his tone wasn't quite there. We hadn't quite fine-tuned it. And we got into this debate about, like, if he says something and it's kind of rude, his tone's kind of nasty, but he's pretty much saying something that's accurate, that if he said it a little bit more nicely, it would have been pretty appropriate. And we got into this debate of, should he get the check mark on his behavior chart to say, like, you did everything that you're supposed to do in this class? And we got to the point where, yes, we were still working on tone. We were still working on how to act appropriately. And we were still working on the ideal thing that we wanted, which is for him to control his emotions, him to not yell out in the middle of class. But we eventually came to the realization that his behaviors were not totally appropriate, but they were effective and they were functional. So what we did, instead of saying he will be appropriate, we said he will be functional. So that's really the word that we want to use instead of appropriate. And the reason that we settled for that in that given situation was not because we weren't going to continue to fine-tune that behavior, but because we didn't want to penalize him for something that really wasn't doing a ton of harm to a lot of people. We were able to manage it so it wasn't too disruptive, wasn't too bothersome to anybody else. And we didn't want to penalize him for where he was at in his ability with that particular skill. So it's kind of like how if you are working through math problems or something like that, and you're working on getting harder and harder, and everybody else is up here doing multiplication and you're still down here doing addition, we don't want to necessarily penalize you just because you're down here. Like, you don't have the skill yet to multiply, so we're not going to penalize you. So all we went for in that situation was, we want you to be functional. We want you to say what it is that you're feeling, and we will continue to reward and give praise and lots of practice with appropriate tone of voice, but we're not going to penalize you for saying something that isn't perfectly said, because we know that you're continuing to shape that behavior. So when it comes to acting appropriately for a lot of these students, sometimes we need to meet them where they're at and accept functional instead of saying they're going to act appropriately. Because what's appropriate is, it's so dependent on culture, it's so dependent on context. And think about when you go to another country, certain countries, you might do things in America that might be considered really rude and inappropriate in another country, or vice versa. There are certain countries where people are a little bit more in your face, might say things that might be considered rude in America. So it's one of those things that it gets into, because we're talking about that hidden curriculum, it gets into this gray area. I mean, and even think about different family dynamics where, like, I have a friend who, his family, they're all just really loud and in your face, and all that stuff that is totally normal for their family and the way that they interact and would not be considered rude would be considered appalling in other people's families who might be more quiet and reserved. So this is why we always want to be coming back to, okay, he's not acting appropriate, but is it functional and is it effective? And is it hurting anybody? So there were certain situations with this particular student where we absolutely had to address them. We can't have somebody hitting and injuring people. We can't have a kid in second grade swearing loudly in the classroom, even though we recognize that it was, again, we were meeting him where he was at, but we still reprimanded for that behavior. But when we got to this other subtle area, we accepted functional over appropriate. So that's really the takeaway from today, is that sometimes it's okay to settle for functional if it is where the student's at, and just in the name of not wanting to necessarily nitpick everything that student does, because we know that a lot of these things that are obvious to us are not so obvious to them. So I'm going to wrap this up right now, and I wanted to just reiterate a couple of those announcements that I did at the very beginning. So again, I just shared that most recent blog post where I dive into that framework that I talked about a little bit further, where I talked about the 3 components of behaviors that we need in order to be able to function in a social situation. We need to be able to integrate how we're thinking, how we're feeling, and what we're doing. They all need to go together. They all are a cycle and they impact each other. How we think impacts how we feel, but how we feel impacts how we think and what we do. What we do in a certain situation gives us feedback, which impacts how we feel and what we think of that situation, and so on. So we need to be able to integrate all 3 of those behaviors, talk about it in the blog post that I've shared in the comments. And then I'm also going to be doing an in-depth presentation next week. The preview, or the pre-showing, is going to be next Monday, August 12th at 9 a.m. It's going to be about a 60 to 90 minute presentation. You'll be able to pop on live, or you'll be able to watch it later if you're not able to watch the whole thing. And then there will be an official live webinar on Sunday night on the 18th, and then also Monday night on the 19th, which will be the same, the official presentation from the live that I'm doing next week. So thanks so much for everybody who tuned in today. And feel free to pop any other questions that you have about supporting students with high functioning autism. And if you've got questions about supporting students with low functioning autism as well, I may segue to that after this month or so. In August, we're going to be really focusing on high functioning, but if people have a lot of questions about low functioning, we may segue to that afterwards. So also let me know your questions about that. You can just pop them in the chat and let me know where you're struggling, what questions, concerns, comments you have about treating this population. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great day.